Let's bring John McMullen in on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, get his take on some of the Eagles and NFL news that is happening right now. We'll start off with the trade, John. Emmanuel Sanders and a fifth to San Francisco for a third and a fourth. If you're Philly, would you have been in on that deal?
Well, it's kind of tough, and I'll tell you why. And I said the same thing about Mohamed Sanu, who went a little bit earlier for a second-round pick, which is really a steep price. But, it kind of depends on, is Deshaun Jackson going to be back? And the only people who know that are the Eagles. And if he is going to be back, then no. I mean, where do these guys fit on this particular team? So it's kind of tough. If you're telling me Deshaun is not going to play for the rest of the season, yeah, then they need some help, and they badly need some help. If he's going to be here, then all of a sudden, if you trade for a player like Sanders or even Sanu, where do they fit? Are you sitting Alshon Jeffrey? Are you sitting Nelson Aguilar in the slot? I know a lot of people would like to do that after the disconnected deep ball in Dallas, but makes $9.4 million. So you have to put all of this into the equation. And right now, I think there are far bigger needs. Defensive tackle being one of them, linebacker being another, and you could even say corner, although that's probably less of a need too because guys are getting healthier. Ronald Darby's probably going to be back this week. And then quickly behind that, Cre'Von LeBlanc and maybe Avonte Maddox, which is, I think, a little bit more uncertain.
Yeah, and I had tweeted out the other day, John, which is if the Eagles are in play for a wide receiver, it means one of two things. One, they think Deshaun Jackson's shot and can't come back. Or two, they're ready to sit Nelson Aguilar, which does not seem to be something they're willing to do. So that's why I don't know that they're going to be involved with a A.J. Green or any wide receiver that's name is out there. Then people think that they need a wide receiver. Unless one of those two things happen, I don't see them involved on a wideout.
Yeah, and more than Nelson, as I said, it has to do with Deshaun. So it has to do with his health. And if the Eagles believe that he's not going to make it back, then, yeah, they should be in on all these conversations. But you do have to be realistic. And I know fans don't care about the salary cap part of it, but you can't pay somebody $9.4 million to sit on the bench. That's just not how this industry works. So that does enter into the
even
equation.
Halfway through a year where you only have to suck it up for 8 games.
Well, I mean, you can. I guess you can do anything from that perspective, but you're kind of admitting, and it's difficult for teams to do, and not just the Eagles. You're kind of admitting you made a massive mistake, which they probably did. And the only way you can fix a mistake is to admit it. But again, I'm taking the more realistic approach. Teams don't do that. They just don't.
All right, John, a lot today from the presser. Number one, I thought it was odd yesterday that the second question in the Doug Pederson presser was about Sidney Jones. I felt there was a lot of other things that happened in that game that Jones's lack of playing time didn't seem to be that important. However, today, Jim Schwartz, the first question fired off was about Sidney Jones. So what new news do we have about Sidney Jones and his role?
Well, Doug kind of, I explained, played better defense on Monday than Sidney ever has when he was trying to explain why he wasn't on the field. And I think it had more to do with the fact that I think people understood when Jalen was out there, Jalen Mills, they understood why he wasn't playing. The bigger issue came when Jalen left the game late and they went to Craig James. And then you start asking yourself, well, what the heck is going on here? And Jim Schwartz kind of explained that and said the game plan that Sidney was the backup nickel corner for the Dallas game behind Orlando Scandrick, which is bad enough because Orlando got cut after the game. So it kind of tells you where he is on the totem pole. Now, while I say that, he's got to play this week. He's going to play in Buffalo. He's going to be the slot corner. He's going to be the nickel corner. And this might be his last opportunity to prove he can play to this team. Because as I just said, Carvon LeBlanc is eligible to come off injured reserve all after the Bills game for Week 9. Now, he hasn't been back at practice. If he was ready to go, he could be practicing, and he wasn't last week. And Avante's a little bit uncertain because Doug said he was still in the concussion protocol, although I'm not sure if he understood that question. He's also got a neck injury as well. So there's kind of a little bit of uncertainty with Avante Maddox, but they're both coming around the bend, as Jim Schwartz explained. So just because he's going to be out there this week doesn't mean he's going to be out there anything past this week, especially if he performs poorly again.
John, we're talking about potential additions, via trade that the Eagles can acquire. We're talking about guys coming back from injury, the depth chart, who's in, who's out, as far as personnel moves.
We did that segment already.
We already did do it. But for you, where do you start? If you're Doug Pederson, where do you start with this team and preparing for Buffalo coming off that loss? What's the number one adjustment or priority?
Well, I think it's about yourself more than the Bills. I really do. And that they have to fix their own house before they start looking outside the house. And there's a lot of issues, and there's a lot of issues on both sides of the ball. And we kind of got into it a little bit yesterday. Yesterday. Some of them maybe aren't fixable. Maybe, I talk all the time about this stasis and whether it's people assuming players are going to stay the same, and they don't. We often talk about the NFL kind of moves in dog years. It moves really, really quickly. And just because you were a good player 2 years ago doesn't mean you're a good player today. And the Eagles bet on these veteran players, and I get it, and that's what you should do when you consider yourself a contender, but they've been wrong. And these guys haven't stayed healthy, so many of them. And we talk about Darren Sproles and Jason Peters, Deshaun Jackson. These are all over 30 guys, and you're rolling the dice, and every single one of them that is supposed to be a big impact on your offense can't play right now. And then we talk about the guys who are playing, and I mentioned Malcolm and Rodney, at least the past couple of weeks, as aging players that seem to be on a downward trend. Too much of that, and then the injuries are real. I mean, you lose Malik Jackson, then you lose Tim Jernigan, then you lose Hassan Ridgeway. They're picking up defensive tackles off practice squads around the league. We talk about multiple injuries at the same position. That's devastating. And it's happened to them at defensive tackle and corner. They're starting to get a little bit healthier at corner. I think that will help at least settle things down. So there's so many issues on both sides of the ball. They got to fix themselves before they start thinking about the other team.
John, you mentioned that a player could be great a year or 2 years ago. It doesn't mean they're going to be good this year. So how does that relate to coaching and Doug Pederson? How do you assess? Listen, I'm not saying he needs to be fired. I'm not saying he's a bad coach. But anyone who's watched this game and followed this team as closely as you have, John, I think you can see after that game on Sunday night that Doug seems to be a little bit off. Maybe I'm completely off with that assessment. But how do you assess his performance as a coach so far?
I think it's been uneven. I think there's some issues I think it's fair to point out. And a couple of them I mentioned yesterday, dealing with the young players, Miles Sanders, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. Why are you giving one a longer rope than the other? Why can't the other get on the field? Why, especially when you look at their counterparts? Remember, it's Miles Sanders or Jordan Howard. Well, Jordan Howard has performed. On the other side, it's J.J. Arcega-Whiteside versus Mac Hollins. Mac Hollins, the veteran, has not performed. So why do they keep defaulting to Miles Sanders and not J.J.? To me, that's a legitimate coaching criticism that doesn't make a lot of sense. And while we don't get to watch practice during the regular season. We do get to watch practice throughout the off season and up through training camp. And all JJ did was make plays in practice, and everybody was raving about him. So I find it hard to believe that's gone in a completely negative direction.
Well, and let me can I just interject this question? Like, I agree. Like, do you think it goes off the one drop that he had that has just like eliminated him from consideration?
That'd be crazy.
Well, I hope not. Their explanation is on position, and basically, in other words, if Alshon had been injured and not Deshaun, JJ would be playing and Mac wouldn't. But again, you got to cross-train these younger players, and especially when the other guy, as I explained, is stinking up the joint. There's no other way to explain it. You got to try something else. So I do think there are legitimate criticisms that you can place on the coaching staff, as I was saying. But the bigger criticisms have to be placed on personnel decisions and Howie Roseman. I just mentioned the aging, the overvaluing of certain players, the undervaluing of certain positions, namely linebacker. I mean, you look at the Dallas Cowboys and you see Jalen Smith and Leighton Vander Esch out there and their ability to make plays. And then, Leighton gets hurt and they're able to bring in Sean Lee. And the Eagles are rolling out Nate Gary and Camus Grugier-Hill. I mean, people kill Jim Schwartz. I will never get that. I will never get that.
Well, let me ask you this, because you asked Schwartz today about the linebackers. With Bradham's injury, Brown's out. You start Gary and Hill. You wanted to know how he held up. He said, well, not good enough to win. My question for you is, does Schwartz prefer a defense with linebackers, or is that a more organizational philosophy, meaning Roseman doesn't value them, so therefore Schwartz doesn't get them? Would Schwartz value saying, hey, can you get me some damn linebackers, or is that a defense? Is that a position on his defense that he doesn't value?
No, I think it's more the organization doesn't value. And what they do value is Jim Schwartz, because, you go all the way back to the draft, and you look at the Eagles trading away picks and only having 5 picks in the entire draft for the second straight year, and you look at who they picked, and all they gave Jim was Sharif Miller, who hasn't even played. He did dress finally because there's so many other injuries. I mean, they gave him some fishing line and wire and gum and tell him to put something together like MacGyver. And sometimes he can do it and sometimes he can't. This is arguably, now part of it is injury-wise. Nigel Bradham wasn't able to play. We've talked about all the injuries at corner as they're trying to get back. Zach Brown was cut. L.J. Fort was cut. And by the way, making plays in Baltimore. What lined up in Dallas, you could argue, is the worst back seven in the NFL last week from a talent perspective. And what do you do with that?
The whole secondary corner stuff. I mean, in that building, obviously they said, yeah, we got Maddox, Darby. And by the way, Darby going to play this week against his former team?
I think so. Okay. I mean, he dressed, but only in case of emergency. So he was back at practice last week, limited fashion every day. But he did dress. They kept him out, didn't play him. So I think he'll ramp up. I think he'll continue to practice this week. And unless he suffers another setback, I think he's going to be out there. And that will help, because you've kind of seen over the past 2 weeks, I give Rasul Douglas a ton of credit early in the season. I thought he played very well. But the more you play limited players, the more they get exposed. And you've kind of seen it when that competition ramped up, and it's Diggs and Thielen and Cooper. Well, Rasul Douglas hasn't held up, and that shouldn't be surprising.
No, but so how much is the feeling? Darby's back, Mills back. They're going to probably get Maddox back soon. They're going to get Crevon LeBlanc back soon. They got Douglas. They got Jones. I mean, how much is it like, look, we won the Super Bowl with this group of guys. I mean, yes, Patrick Robinson was there that season, but, I mean, is that really the mindset of we don't need help at that position? These guys won the Super Bowl, so if we're going to get help, it's going to be someplace else.
Well, I don't know. I see a lot of people, and even I just talked about not valuing linebackers. I talked about Leighton Vander Esch. Now, if you go back to 2018, the Eagles would have drafted Leighton Vander Esch if he got to 32. Ended up, he didn't even get close. And I often talk about people say they don't value running backs. Well, if you go back to 2017, they wanted Christian McCaffrey, they wanted Dalvin Cook, they weren't able to get him. If the right player is there, they will go and they will certainly take them. But it's not easy to get players like that because other teams want them really bad as well, and it didn't work out. So what they aren't going to do is take players that they don't value at that position. And running back, it's somebody who can handle all three downs and do things in a well-rounded fashion. Same thing in linebacker. And there aren't a ton of people who can do that, to be honest. So while I do say that, same thing at corner. The Eagles offered a first and a second-round pick for Jalen Ramsey. That's significant. That's very, very significant. So it's not like they wouldn't take an upgrade. But if you look at, you can't trade for everything. You can't obviously get every player you want. I think they have bigger needs now on this team than cornerback because these guys are all coming back. They're not great, but they're serviceable. So I think there are greater needs, and I think you got to kind of turn the page. They tried to get Ramsey. They couldn't do it. Do you really want a Chris Harris instead of a defensive tackle or, as I said, a linebacker if you can go in that direction? That's questions Howie Roseman has to answer, but I don't think corner is their biggest need right now with all these guys coming back.
John, something that goes along with what you're saying right here is what Malcolm Jenkins had to say today. And I thought it was really interesting, and maybe I'm overanalyzing it, but he mentioned the struggles, and he looked to last year. And in 2018, he said the difference in last season, especially after that Saints blowout, which a lot of people are comparing to the Cowboys blowout on Sunday, he said we simplified things, especially on offense, i.e. insert Nick Foles coming in under center instead of Carson Wentz. And he said they even simplified things on defense. But do you feel like the guys on defense in that locker room right now are kind of pointing over at the offense saying, these guys are just really killing us? They turned it over twice early in Dallas. They can't get anything going. Like, is there a divide there, and is he on to something with those comments?
Well, I mean, I advocated Jim play cover 2 in Minnesota, and that's essentially simplifying things. So I don't disagree with the sentiments from Malcolm, but I will also say he doesn't want to play cover 2. So I mean, he's part of the issue as well from that perspective, because that's the last thing he wants to do as a player. He'd do it, but I do think you have to put that into the equation. And there was this old Don Shula quote he used to say back in the day that don't point fingers, because the minute you point fingers, there's going to be 3 people pointing them back at you. And there are many, many, many reasons to point fingers at this defense. In Dallas, yeah. I mean, it was the offense. Fumble, 14-0. No question about it. Carson Wentz's first game of the year. They stunk up. They were terrible. But the defense has been just as terrible at times, arguably more terrible. So I wouldn't be pointing fingers if I'm on either side of the football right now.
John McMullen at JF McMullen, of course, Football at 4 every day right here on the Sports Bash. The Eagles getting ready for Buffalo. And it's funny because I saw that you asked Schwartz a question about Buffalo, and you can see that he much rather answer questions regarding a game than his own team and or what's going on there, because that was the longest answer of the day.
Yeah, well, they feel it's like throwing them a life raft. And I get along with you, so I threw him a life raft. But also, we don't get to talk to the coordinators later in the week, so you got to ask something about the opponent.
Right.
And I think it's an interesting opponent this week because obviously it's an AFC team.
They gave up 21 points to the Dolphins. They stink.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at they're 5-1, but if you look at the wins, it's not impressive.
They're a tough team to read.
Yeah. So I do think, but they're interesting because I think Josh Allen is a strange quarterback in the fact that he's so athletic and he's got this tremendous arm strength that can get the deep ball, but he can't do much else as far as accuracy and intermediate routes. So it's a bit strange, and you mentioned how he's a little bit like Cam Newton. They use design quarterback runs because he's so big and so strong. Yeah, a little bit of a strange opponent, and you don't get to see this very often. So maybe it will be a little helpful from the Eagles' perspective because I don't think this is the team that can throw for 400 yards on you.
Probably.
And so that'll help the embattled, confident, shaken corners, except Jalen Mills, who's got more confidence than probably should have.
Yeah, that's right. Real quick, so Mike Groh was asked today about Aguilar on the deep ball. How did he explain what he saw on that play?
Boy, this is he said he didn't track the football. Nelson said he didn't track the football.
I'm giving you the chance to pat yourself on the back. I led you right into it.
I told everybody he didn't track the football. I don't know why people don't believe us. We're not lying to you. Now, Mike isn't going to throw him under the bus. And I asked.
Well, he said, I thought he gave tremendous effort.
Yeah, he does. Like I said,
that's a pretty strong adjective there. Tremendous effort.
That's as strong as it gets.
Look, if you are at the NovaCare complex all the time, if you watch practice throughout training camp, what I just mentioned, you're never going to question Nelson Aguilar's work ethic. You're not.
I will.
Let me just. That's not his problem.
Right. He said, I thought he located the ball maybe a little bit later in the down than he would like, and made it difficult because he located it late. He wasn't able to catch up to it. Had he located it sooner, maybe he would have taken a little bit course and would have been there. So he said, I do want to say this, though, in terms of Nelson's effort in our games and the things that he does for this team, I don't think that effort should ever be questioned. So in other words, he says he stinks.
As a downfield receiver, and I've told people this for many years, and like I said, Nelson doesn't like it either, but he doesn't track the football. He's not a good downfield receiver.
Yeah.
What he can do is he's very athletic. He's very fast. He does work extremely hard. And if you get the football in his hands near the line of scrimmage in space, he can do some things. But if you're going to make him a downfield receiver, you're going to have these issues every week. And they existed. It wasn't as bad looking as it was in Dallas, but if you go back to that Minnesota play when they tried to post in the end zone, that looked bad too. Because as soon as he gets bumped down the field, he loses concentration, can't track the football, looks tremendously awkward, as I said yesterday. He just doesn't do it well. And we talked about the coaching issue. This is part of the coaching issue as well. They shouldn't be putting him in these situations because he's not good at it. And they know he's not good at it. As you just mentioned, Mike, They know he's not good at it, and yet they keep doing it.
John McMullen, all guests appear via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. And tomorrow, Football at 4. We got plenty more on the Eagles and Bills, a tough opponent, 5-1. When this game came out, you're like, at Buffalo, no problem. Well, 5-1 Buffalo, 3-4 Philadelphia. We got more on that tomorrow here on Football at 4. Thanks, pal.
All right, thank you, guys.
Johnny Mack, like all guests, appeared by the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.